Part 4. About 10 strong men had emerged from the forest, forming a semi-circle around the coach. None of these men were equipped in exactly the same way. Still, while they were not masterworks, their equipment was not of poor make. It was clear that they had hand-picked their weapons. The casual way in which they were discussing how to deal with their target and the order in which they would go sounded like they already had their prey in the bag. Indeed, they had done this sort of thing countless times in the past. It would be strange if they had felt worried. After Zack leapt off the driver's seat, he jogged over to the men who had appeared. While dismounting from the driver's seat, he had cut the reins so the coach would not be able to drive off, and after monkeying with the coach doors, they would only open on the side facing the men. The men brandished their weapons so their prey could see. This was a wordless warning. If they did not come out quickly, they would be in trouble. In response, the coach doors slowly opened. A beautiful woman revealed herself under the moonlight. The gathered sellswords and bandits laughed coarsely and looked on her with lustful eyes. It was clear from their expressions that they were delighted. However, one person among them was taken aback. That person was Zack. His surprise could be summarized in 3 words. Who is this? Zack had never seen this beauty before. However, the coach was very familiar to him, and the contrast between the two plunged Zack into confusion and left him speechless. After that, another beautiful woman appeared, dressed much like the first. Doubt began blooming on the men's faces. Their targets should have been an heiress who did not know how the world worked, as well as an old butler. And then, a girl who might have been considered little showed up, and their doubts vanished. Her silvery hair gleamed in the moonlight, and her dewy, crimson eyes held a seductive radiance. The bandits could only gasp at the sight of these beauties, unable to so much as muster up the words for praise. In this moment, even their bestial lust shrank away in the face of true beauty. Shaltir smiled lewdly as she bathed in the enthralled gazes of the men. She advanced unguardedly before them and said, "Gentlemen, thank you for coming all this way here for me. May I know who is your leader? May I negotiate with him?" After seeing the bandits look toward the same person, Shaltir learned what she needed to know. That was to say, everyone else here was expendable. What do you want to talk about? The man who looked like their leader seemed to have come to his senses after his close encounter with these beautiful women. He strode forward. Please forgive the misunderstanding. What I meant by negotiations was just a joke for me to learn what I need to know. Sorry about that. Who are you people? Shaltir looked to Zack, who had asked that question. You must be that Zack fellow. I will give you the solution as promised, so could you please step aside for a while? Some of the bandits sought an answer for their confusion in each other's faces. However, among them, HMPH, you've got a good body for a brat. I'll make you cry for me in a bit. The bandit who happened to be standing in front of Shaltir reached out to grope that ample bust of hers, which did not match her age. And then the appendage tumbled to the ground. Could you not touch me with your filthy hand? The dumbfounded man looked at his now handless arm, and after a moment's delay, he wailed. My hand. You're making so much noise over losing a single hand. Are you even a man? Shaltir casually flicked her hand as she muttered quietly, and the man's head fell to the earth as well. How had she chopped his head off with her unarmed, dainty, and slender hands? The nightmare before them hardly seemed real. The bandits were terrified beyond all capacity for rational thought, unable to react in the wake of this tremendous shock. However, what they saw next snapped them back to their senses. The fresh blood spurting from the severed portions of the body moved as though it had a will of its own, gathering above Shaltir's head and forming an orb of blood. Shaltir and company knew this was the effect of the skill called Blood Pool. However, the first thing these clueless bandits thought as they saw this inhuman ability was, "She's a magic caster." Anyone who understood magic should have been able to give a more accurate warning. Magic caster was a very broad term which referred to many professions and jobs, and the means of dealing with them were just as varied. In particular, one might think of Shaltir, who only wore a dress, as an arcane magic caster, or perhaps a spiritual magic caster. However, none of them spoke a warning like that. One could thus conclude that none of them knew anything about magic. In other words, they thought of anything they could not understand as magic. As Shaltir realized this, she looked disinterestedly at these panicking bandits, who desperately raised their swords against her. How boring. Clean this mess up. Also, leave this one and that one. Understood? Yes, Shaltir-sama. The vampire brides waiting behind Shaltir on either side stepped forward, and one of them punched the face of a bandit trying to attack Shaltir, sending him flying. It looked as though someone had swung a metal pole into his face with all their strength. The bandits arced through the air, accompanied by the sound of something like a filled balloon popping. All manner of bodily fluids, blood, brain matter, and more burst forth from his skull. The gore gleamed under the moonlight, looking all the more beautiful for its horrific appearance. More than half of the bandit's head went flying, and pinkish brains sprayed from the shattered cranium. Pulled by gravity, the bandit's corpse rolled to the ground with a great thud. That sound was a starting bell which filled the bandits with terror, and Shaltir with delight. Zack smiled stiffly as he watched the scene in front of him. It was a truly horrific sight. He wanted to vomit as he smelled the blood which came from the carnage before him. Men had their hands and feet torn off like scraps of paper, and skulls popped between paired hands like ripe pomegranates. A breastplate was ripped off and a hand stabbed into the now exposed belly. When it came back out, it took several meters of gleaming, slippery intestine with it. The fact that the victim was still alive after that spoke of the resilience of mankind. A man was squirming on the ground, trying to flee even with both legs broken. White-colored objects, his broken bones protruded through his skin and flesh. He was desperately trying to crawl away with his hands, struggling to get to himself away from the source of this horror, wanting to stay alive for just one moment longer. The beautiful girl looked at the man groveling at her feet, and her shrill laugh grated at him. How had things ended up like this? Zack thought as hard as he could. No matter how one tried to cloak it in politeness, the world still ran on the principle of the strong feeding on the weak. It was utterly natural for the strong to oppress the weak. After all, Zack had been doing so himself. However, was it right for the strong to go so far and do so much? Of course not. He could not accept their cruel methods of killing. Then, what should he do? The enemy was simply choosing not to attack him, so if he tried to flee, they would probably do something to him to make him not dare to escape again. Something painful and nausea-inducing, for instance. Zack felt for his hidden short sword through his clothing. Why was his sword so small? How could it possibly stand up to these monsters which could twist off men's arms so effortlessly? What had he done to them? He had never thought of doing anything to those monsters. Zack hugged himself, as though trying to conceal his presence. The rhythmic grinding of his teeth suddenly struck him as extremely grating. What would happen if those monsters heard it and went after him? He tried to stop himself, but his teeth would not listen to him and continued grinding. Speaking of which, what kind of people were they? Zack did not recognize them at all. And just as he thought about that, "Zack-san, come this way." A gentle, dulcet voice came from behind him, completely at odds with the cruel scenery in front of him. Zack looked fearfully behind himself, and saw his employer standing before him. Her expression did not match the haughty and argumentative heiress that he knew her for. If he had been calm enough, he might have felt suspicious about this, but Zack, who had been driven into confusion by this bizarre world and the stink of blood, had no energy left to suspect anything. "What are those monsters?" Zack wailed, his voice cracking, at Solution, the moneyed daughter of nobility who knew nothing of the world. "Why didn't you tell me there were monsters like these around?" Indeed. WashOurWorldAudio.com. If he had known about this beforehand, things would not have ended up like this. The bitch before him was responsible for the frightening scene before him. "Don't keep quiet, speak up. Let's get this straight. This is all your fault." Anxiety and terror combined to impel him forward, and a furious Zack could no longer bear it. He reached out to grab Solution by the collar and roughly shook her. "I understand. Please follow me." Are you going to save me?" "No, I simply wish to take this last chance to enjoy you." An ivory pale hand, cold as ice, gripped Zack's own, and then Solution stepped forward, pulling him away. "Even though I already have permission, Ciba-sama does not like this sort of thing, so I would rather do it at a distance." He had no idea what she was talking about. However, Zack felt that if he alone was being led away, there might be a chance that he could survive. Zack pretended not to hear the horrific screams from behind him. That could not be helped. Zack was too weak. He could not possibly save those comrades of his which were supposed to be stronger than him. "Please don't be too excited. If possible, I'd like you to be gentle with me. It would make me very happy." Behind the coach, Solution spoke softly to Zack as she waved him over, then reached behind her back, as though to undo her dress. As Zack saw this, he stared with his mouth open. What was this woman up to? Zack looked at Solution like she was some sort of exotic creature. Solution's hands had not stopped at all during all this, and so a thoroughly confused Zack asked, What are you doing? What do you think?" With that, Solution easily peeled off her figure-hugging bodice. As though waiting for that moment, her tightly bound breasts sprang forth. They were firm, springy globes, and her skin seemed vaguely translucent under the moonlight. Zack gulped at the sight before him. "Please." Solution thrust her chest out, as though inviting him to fondle her. "What do you want me to?" Zack had forgotten himself as he fixated on the body before him. She was beautiful. This was the most beautiful female body Zack had ever seen in his life. Of all the girls Zack had partaken of, the most beautiful was one who belonged to a caravan which he had attacked. However, by the time it was Zack's turn, the girl was exhausted. She lay motionless, only spreading her legs like a frog. Still, it had not detracted from her beauty in the least. However, the girl before him was even more beautiful, and she was not unresponsive like the other girl. Desire lit the flames of Zack's lust, and the heat in his lower body began spreading out from his crotch. Panting like a dog, he reached out for Solution's body. It felt like silk. Zack could no longer hold himself back, and he seized the more shapely of Solution's breasts. And then his entire hand sank into her. Zack thought for a moment that her body was so soft that it felt as though his entire hand had gone into her. But as he looked at his hand, he realized that this was not the case. Zack's hand had literally sunk into Solution's body. What the hell is this? Zack screamed in surprise and tried to pull his hand back, but he could not budge it. Not only did it not move back, it was sucked further in. It seemed as though there were many writhing tentacles inside Solution which had latched onto Zack's hand and were drawing him in. Solution's beautiful face did not change even under these strange circumstances. She simply watched Zack in silence. Her expression was that of a scientist watching as a lab animal was injected with some lethal chemical, blending a cold dispassion with curiosity and excitement. "Oi, stop. Let go of me." Zack balled up his other hand into a fist and swung with all his strength at Solution's pretty face. Once, twice, 3 times. Zack swung at full force, punching heavily and not caring if his fist was injured. That beautiful face remained unmoved despite a grown man striking it with all his might. It did not seem to hurt her at all. Instead, Zack was frightened by what he felt when he hit her. That sensation was like punching a soft-filled waterskin. Under normal circumstances, there should have been some resistance to his punch, but he did not feel that he had struck bone at all. This was not how punching a human being should have felt. The unreal scene of carnage behind him, forgotten due to his excitement, suddenly flashed through his mind. Zack choked back the impulse to scream. Eventually, it dawned upon him. The woman bearing her chest to him before his eyes was also a monster. Did you finally realize it? Then, let's begin the fun part, shall we? As she said that, a pain like the stabbing of hundreds of needles radiated from his stuck hand. "Ah, I am now dissolving your hand." Zack could not understand these cold words through the agony which gripped him. This was no longer in the realm of his comprehension. The truth is, I deeply enjoy watching things dissolve. Therefore, I felt it was a happy coincidence that you wanted to be inside me, Zack-san. Gee, you damn monster, go to hell. Fighting back the pain, Zack drew his short sword as he shouted at her. Then, he forcefully stabbed at Solution's pretty face, and her body quivered. Take that. However, Zack immediately realized that he had been far too hasty. What good would stabbing the surface of a lake with a short sword do? It would merely make more ripples, and that was what happened. Solution turned to look at Zack, still with a short sword sticking out of her face, and then she gently said, "I'm sorry, but I am resistant to physical attacks, so a blow like that cannot harm me. Then, I shall dissolve it." An acrid stench seared his nose, and within seconds, the short sword fell from Solution's face, its blade half dissolved. Just as she had said, her beautiful, unmarred visage lay before his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" The agony in his hand was slowly spreading up the rest of his arm, but the fear of impending death overrode his pain, and Zack asked his question even as tears brimmed in his eyes. However, the answer made him want to stuff his fingers in his ears to deny it. "I am a predatory slime. Since time is limited, I will need to swallow you up." Zack's arms were pulled into Solution's body. So forceful was the suction that Zack could not resist it, even if he were capable of doing so. "Stop, stop, 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 stop. Spare me, spare me, spare me please." Zack cried and begged, but the force drawing him into Solution's body was still very strong, enough that a human being could not resist it. His arms, his shoulders, all of them were steadily devoured by her body. Lia. With that last scream, Zack's face was sucked into Solution's body. And so, Zack was swallowed whole, as though he were a python's prey. After a few minutes had passed, there were no longer any survivors. The place was one which reeked of a foul stench. No, one man still survived. He worked his tongue as he squatted near Shaltier's feet, licking her high-heeled shoes clean of the brain matter which had spattered them after she had playfully crushed a bandit's skull underfoot. Shaltier looked on her now cleaned heels in satisfaction. "Well done. Then, in accordance with our agreement, I shall not take your life." The man, his frightened features scrunched up into a ball, looked up at Shaltier with a grateful expression on his face and kowtowed repeatedly to her in thanks. Shaltier looked lovingly upon this puppy-like man, and then snapped her fingers. "Train him. Once the two vampire brides came to his side, the man finally understood what those words meant. The undead are technically still alive, so I was not lying to you. The vampire brides bit eagerly into him, and Shaltir looked out of the corner of her eye at the man as his life force was drained away from him. She turned to Solution, who was rearranging her messed up collar as she emerged from the direction of the coach, and said, "Oh, is it over?" "Yes, I was quite satisfied. I am profoundly grateful to you for this. No need to stand on ceremony. We're all servants of Nazarick, after all. Speaking of which, did that human have fun? He is currently enjoying himself. Would you like to see?" May I? Then, let me have a quick look." A man's arm suddenly erupted from Solution's face, accompanied by a vile stench that stung the nose. The source of the odor was that arm. Its muscles were badly dissolved after being exposed to powerful acid, and the reaction of the blood from within the muscles and the acid created gouts of thick fumes. The arm thrashed about like it had emerged from the surface of a lake, desperately struggling to find a grip on something. Juices flowed from the exposed muscles with every twitch. "My apologies, I did not know he was still so full of energy." Solution was a bizarre sight as she bowed in apology, what with the arm sticking out of her face. She then shoved the arm back into her face, smiling after the flailing arm had been completely swallowed up once more. "It's amazing how you can swallow a man whole and look as though nothing had happened. Thank you for your praise. It is not outwardly visible because the interior of my body was originally empty. In addition, I have always been a creature like this, so this must be the effect of some sort of specialized magic. Oh this might be a bit nosy of me, but when will he die? I could secrete a stronger acid to kill him immediately if you wish, but since a human who wishes to enter me is a rare occasion, I would like to let him enjoy it for an entire day." "I didn't hear any screams. Did you corrode him with acid?" "No, I did not. If I dissolved his throat with acid, he might suffocate due to being unable to breathe. Therefore, inserted part of my body into him to suppress his voice, and it also has the effect of preventing bad smells. I'm quite impressed by your attitude of paying close attention to your toys and playing with them for as long as possible. Incidentally, can you corrode specific places with your acids? For instance, only corroding a certain place? Indeed, that is an easy task to accomplish. The proof of that are the scrolls, potions, and other magic items within my body, and the fact that those items are intact. I could move freely even if I were to take your body within mine, Shaltir Sama, though I would have to ask that you did not move too much. Predatory slimes sure are amazing. Do you want to play together next time? That will be fine. Although, where do you plan to get the toys from?" Shaltir smiled happily when she found Solution looking at the vampire brides behind her. "Those girls aren't half bad, but I want to wait until someone tries to invade us and then plead with Ain Sama to give them to us. Then, please do not forget about my share. I would like to swallow them up to the chest and expose the rest of them. That ought to be quite interesting as well." "Not bad. Do you get along with that interrogator? Uranus Sama, the Special Intelligence Gathering Officer? Regretfully, I cannot understand that person's aesthetic sense." Shaltir planned to continue, but she was interrupted by a voice behind her. "Solution, I finish up over here. We can move out any time," Sebas called out from the driver's seat, having replaced the reins. "Understood, I'm coming." Then, Shaltir Sama, though it pains my heart to leave, allow me to bid you farewell. Shaltir looked to Solution as she hurried back into the coach, and then to Sebas, who was seated at the driver's place. "Then, we shall part ways for the time being, Sebas." "Is that so? Does this mean you have already discovered the bandits' hideout?" "Indeed. We shall invade him afterwards and look for any interesting people who might know something which would please Ain Sama. Otherwise this would have all been a waste of time. I see. It was a pleasure traveling with you, Shaltir Sama. Thank you for that. Let us meet again in Nazarick. Oh, we'll be off then. End chapter.